Like I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm in Montreal, Canada, so it's 8:26 a.m., so quite early. Welcome to the sixth annual conference, Refugee Law Initiative, under the theme Improving the Global Refugee Regime from Theory to Practice. So, my name is Sophie Kanza, and I am a refugee activist originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, with over 20 years of lived experience as a refugee in South Africa. Um, and before we jump into the session, I'd like to go over some ground rules. So, our speakers today will start us off by presenting key perspectives on four different components of the said issue. After which we will open up for broader discussion, questions, and comments from other participants. Each of the speakers on the panel will have about 10 minutes for their presentation, which I will enforce quite strictly. During the session, please make sure to add your questions or comments to the speakers by typing them into the chat box here on Zoom, so that afterwards the speakers, when they finish their presentations, there will be time for us to discuss and reflect on these questions and comments. Please remember to keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you are speaking. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the RLL website as a podcast. If you do not wish to appear on this podcast, you may leave the session right now. If you wish to hide the live transcript at the bottom of your screen, please click the Hide Subtitles button. So as you know, this session is about agents of change in the international refugee regime. And we can jump into it and go straight into our first speaker, who is Dr. Jay Park from the University of Sussex. And she will be speaking about refugees as agents of change, of development, and the case of Burmese political refugee returnees. So over to you, Dr. Jay.
Thank you, Sophie. It is quite unnerving to be the first speaker of one of the first sessions of the international conference, especially because this is my first time participating in an international conference since I've completed my PhD this January. So just a little bit about the research that I'm going to present. This is based on one of the key chapters of my PhD thesis. And the background to doing a PhD in the first place was that I come from a background of being a practitioner on refugee and migration issues for over 15 years, working in Korean NGOs, UNHCR, and finally with the Korean Ministry of Justice, where I started to wonder if I became part of the system that lives off of or perpetuates sometimes refugee situations, and wanted to step back and find an answer to a very fundamental question that I'm sure most of you are all interested in if you are working on refugee issue, is how do we solve refugee issues? It was a very big question, so I narrowed it down to development. How could development be a source of change for refugee situations? And knew of some Burmese refugees in Korea that have returned to Myanmar and were contributing to development in Myanmar. I also wanted to focus the discussions around individual narratives of the refugees themselves, instead of the discussions on refugee issues that often revolve around the states, the law, the institutions. And I wanted to move away from the legal normative perspective or the state level or policy-oriented discourses. So today I'll be presenting a little bit of a background of the case, the context, and then introduce some of the concepts that I've used and the methodology that I used. And also the key discussions will revolve around what is development as defined by my refugee participants, and also some selected cases on how these ideas of development were translated into different development activities of the refugee returnees, and then conclude. So first, the background. So Burmese refugees in Korea, and so by the way, when I say Korea, I do mean South Korea. But yeah, I will be referring to South Korea as Korea throughout the presentation. So these Burmese refugees are mostly male in their 40s to 50s, and of the dominant Bamar ethnic group, Buddhist. And this profile has to do with the fact that when they first arrived in Korea during the 1990s, they were in their 20s, and they arrived as migrant workers, which was one of the only sort of accessible routes, although it wasn't a really formal route, to come to Korea. And they had the ability to do that. So that's why the profile of these refugees have become this way. So Korea, the context of receiving refugees, they were once a refugee origin country, but have changed to a host country since signing on to the Refugee Convention in 1992. But it was only much later on in 2001 that they recognized their first refugee. And they've been constantly criticized, even criticized until now, about the low recognition rate, lengthy procedures, and lack of provision of basic rights in the asylum system. The Burmese refugees played a role in improving some of these conditions that led to some of the changes in partnership with the civil society, which is also a strong component of my research as well. I use the term political refugee, which was the term that were used by the refugees themselves. It has origins on the fact that the grounds for recognition of refugee status were for their political opinion. Some of them were politically engaged in Myanmar, but many of them actually turned to political activism in Korea, setting up the NLD Korea branch, and which was the basis for political activities as protests and fundraising for democracy movement in Myanmar, as well as networking with Koreans on labor and human rights activities. They launched a group application for asylum in 1999, and after a very lengthy process, were recognized as refugee surplus. So this political identity was something that was very strong amongst them, and they wanted to distinguish themselves from other types of refugees. But it was also a part of the Korean civil society's strategy to have them be more accepted into the Korean society by showing the similarities between some of the Korean democracy movement activists back in the 70s to 80s. But it was also due to some of the rigid RSD procedures that they had to undergo, where they have to repeatedly mention that they were not in Korea to earn money, but for political reasons, to seek asylum. They were very well integrated into the Korean society. Many have native level fluency in Korean, and they had strong networks with the civil society. A lot of them, although didn't choose to have Korean citizenship, although they had access to, and this leads to what I'll be explaining as their transnational identity. They still wanted that room to be traveling between Myanmar and Korea, and also contributing to Myanmar's democracy or the development. And they started to return from the 2010s in consistency with what they've always been saying. Once NLD was back in power. So the main concepts that I've used, I'll share three of them, which is development, transnationalism, and social and political remittances. So development, I used a very broad definition of a good change by Robert Chambers. And then what was also really important was including the human development aspect by Amartya Sen. Which explains of development as a process of expanding freedom and capabilities. So the ability of individuals to decide on what they value as a better life. And there was an emphasis on political and civil rights and the right to education. I was conscious about the Korean models of development, where the focus has a lot been on advancing economy and industry. And often the rapid economic growth was at expense of civil liberties and political rights. But the key to my research was what the refugees themselves defined as development, which I'll be sharing throughout the presentation. So transnationalism is the second concept, and this is a process where immigrants forge and sustain multi-stranded social relations that link the societies of origin and settlement, as defined by Bash and others in 1994. So the refugees themselves were transnational, but they were also engaged in transnational networks, and also their return was transnational, which, as defined by Eastman, is an open-ended process that occurs over a long period of time, going back and forth between the origin and host countries. The final concept is of social and political remittance, which is emphasizing the fact that migrants don't send money back, but also ideas, values, beliefs, practices, skills, and culture back to their communities. The method that I used was qualitative, but it was infused with participatory ideas, especially conscious of the fact that when I was conducting the research, I was an employed member of the Korean Korean government, which I'm not anymore. But so I was very conscious about the power relationship that this might impact the research. So I used a lot of reflexive practice. I tried to incorporate collective co-analysis with the refugees while processing this research. It was conducted in 2018. So this context is quite important because it was during the ongoing Rohingya crisis, but also before the last year's military coup in 2021. The method that I used were life history interviews and grounded theory for data collection and analysis that occurs simultaneously through an iterative process. I was also conscious about the ethics of the research as well. The fact that they were the dominant majority, which is reflected in another theme that is not going to be shared in this presentation. And also the internal powers and gatekeeping that occurs among them. So if I can actually share my screen for a bit on. So this is just an example of the, it's a word cloud that I've made during the collective co-analysis exercise where they mentioned what development is for Myanmar. And as you can see, there's a heavy sort of a focus on investment and also education, which I will be mentioning throughout the presentation. So contrary to what I was expecting, they actually mentioned a lot about economic development instead of the civil political development. And the first reason that one of the refugees gave me was that, well, why this shift? And they said, because we are hungry. They added that their roles in political activism has changed because of their age and their position in their society and the obligations they had for individual families. They also had difficulty finding a place when they returned to Myanmar in party politics. So some of them actually I found to be a little bit problematic that they prioritize economic development over democracy or human rights, citing the fact that Korea also went through a similar development process. However, what I found to be quite encouraging was that even the refugee returnees who were focused on businesses, they also had not only a primary career in business, but also had like projects, volunteer activities, and side jobs that went beyond creating their own profit. They invested back into the society of what they've earned. They also ran like vocational training programs for underprivileged children as well. One of the main sort of issues that they have raised was on education and how education is the foundation of all development. The education was not just about education itself, but it was a political action. And they put in political consideration as to who to prioritize and what was being taught and how it was being taught. And it became the basis of political change and development. So some of the examples of the projects that they've been doing is one is an NGO that was co-represented by a Korean health professional and a refugee returnee. And this came from their collaborative work in volunteering at a refugee camp in Myanmar. And then when the refugee returned to Myanmar, he also set up an NGO in collaboration with Korean founding board members who were actually a group of network of people who have been supporting this refugee throughout his time in Korea, having him have access to education and Korean language. The second example was a community-based organization. And this came from the result of a series of community organization trainings that these Burmese refugee returnees were taking part in Korea in 2009. And at the end of the training program, they were asked what did they want to do for democracy in Myanmar. And they said, we'd like to use education. We'd like to start up a computer training program and set up a library. They decided on Hlaing Taryar, an impoverished town in the outskirts of Yangon. And then they invited.
Hi, Dr. J, we've run out of time.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I was so bad in terms of my timing.
Would you like to just finish your sentence and then we can move on to the next?
Sure. So yeah, well, I think these examples basically show that development is, it could be very small scale and individual level, comes from a bottom-up approach. And the key to all of this is having that transnational character of refugees and not putting them into one context or situation over another, which is evidently a policy recommendation that I came out of this. This research. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. So I'd just like to remind the participants that they are more than welcome to add some comments as well as questions for the speakers that we will go through towards the end of the session. So moving swiftly along, our next speaker on the panel is Brian Barber from the University of New South Wales, Australia. And Brian is going to be speaking on improving responsibility, sharing through ground-up approaches. So we're seeing some common themes coming through. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think my presentation will complement very much Dr. J. Park's presentation. So the focus of proposals for refugee regime change are quite often very high level, requiring the mobilization of massive political will. So for example, by adopting an additional protocol on responsibility sharing. While such an initiative would be welcome, today, I'll be arguing for something a bit more incremental and modest, but I believe potentially more impactful and sustainable. And that is developing local protection capacity among an expanding network of actors and pursuing a whole of society approach. I will argue that this concept of a whole of society approach is not just rhetorical, but has practical implications. I'll also argue that in the absence of political will, we can wonder what kind of change is needed, who to engage, where to begin. I argue that we begin with refugees themselves and with host communities and civil society, identifying and addressing needs, mobilizing to address them in practice. And such actions can actually serve to deliver better protection outcomes, but also mobilize political will in the process. In practice, international refugee law is always delivered to refugees on the ground, and usually by a diverse group of stakeholders beyond the state. Needs are diverse. A diverse set of needs requires a diverse set of interventions and specific expertise. No one is an expert in all of these things, and it's unrealistic for any single actor to meet all of the needs alone, even if they are the government or UNHCR. Instead, inevitably, what happens in practice is that a large number of stakeholders collaborate through referrals networks, identifying needs, vulnerabilities, and risks, and making referrals to each other on the basis of those needs. While the theoretical question about the role and responsibility of non-governmental actors is often asked and debated, As an empirical matter, NGOs are in fact providing protection to refugees on the ground. The critical role that non-governmental actors play is visible everywhere, but it's perhaps best demonstrated in states that lack national laws, policies, and practices, as is often the case in the Asia-Pacific region. Refugees and other persons in need of protection are in fact present in large numbers in most of these countries, whether there are laws and policies for their protection or not. And where states fail to deliver protection, it's often refugees themselves, NGOs, lawyers, and other local actors who find ways to save lives, meet needs, and deliver protection in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And these actors and their efforts challenge and change government policy and practice. The needs of refugees and host communities are not being met. Some argue that a lack of political will is the cause and not a lack of capacity. I concede that with political will, much could be accomplished, including developing local protection capacity. But in the absence of political will, the humanitarian imperative still demands action. Some argue that non-state actors let states off the hook when they deliver protection because it's a state's responsibility. But surely the suggestion is not that non-state actors should therefore stand by because it's the government's job. The needs don't go away when states ignore them, and in the absence of political will, other actors have to fill in the gaps. Moreover, the assumption of responsibility by non-state actors for gaps left by state inaction or resistance does not absolve the state of their legal obligations. And furthermore, proactive response by non-state actors can mobilize political will in the process. So I want to share three examples, three country contexts of local protection capacity, taking the initiative and generating political will in the process. First, in Indonesia, the challenges around disembarkation of boats demonstrates a lack of political will. States are engaged in general responsibility avoidance, yet the actions of the Acehnese community and fishermen in Indonesia demonstrate how local protection capacity among non-state actors can precede political will and pull political will along in its wake. It was local fishermen in Aceh who stepped in to rescue boats of Rohingya in 2015 and again in 2020. Local officials subsequently offered support before national authorities then came in. This led to the development of standard operating procedures locally and ultimately to a presidential regulation that was passed in 2016. In Indonesia, the work of refugee-led initiatives is also worth noting. Forthcoming Act for Peace research has identified at least 15 refugee-led initiatives in Indonesia, providing a wide range of services to refugees and host communities. The founding of these RLIs all followed a common progression, from recognition of a common need that was not being met, followed by mobilization among the community to address the gap themselves. RLIs have an awareness and an understanding of needs and priorities that is unlikely to be possessed at a high level within a bureaucracy where, unfortunately, the decision is often made. In Bangladesh, engaging the local legal community has been impactful. Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit is a local NGO that brought a challenge against the government of Bangladesh in the Supreme Court. The court ordered the release of 5 Rohingya detained for illegal entry who had all served their sentences but remained in custody with expulsion orders to Myanmar. The court found that continued detention would be a violation of Article 31 of the Constitution, and that expulsion would violate non-refoulement obligations under the Convention Against Torture and international custom. Forthcoming research by Act for Peace has also considered refugee-led initiatives in Bangladesh. And one prominent example is the Arakan Rohingya Society for Peace and Human Rights, founded and led by a prominent refugee leader, Mohibullah. ARSPH met with international delegations, spoke in the Human Rights Council in Geneva with heads of state, and engaged with the Bangladesh government positively. Yet following repeated attempts to raise the alarm on the increasing insecurity in the camps, and after consistent inaction, Mohibullah was assassinated last year in September. After his killing, several other prominent camp civil society members went into hiding. The effect has been devastating, and the protection context has been greatly diminished by the loss. Every actor is important, and it is complementarity between them that really results in better protection in practice. So one last example is Malaysia. A movement control order was imposed in response to the pandemic, and this was enforced with lockdowns, raids, and arrests. It also resulted in a loss of livelihoods, evictions, and homelessness, ironically for consequences in managing the pandemic. A disinformation and hate speech campaign also followed and targeted the Rohingya. UNHCR, NGOs, and refugee-led initiatives responded with quick interventions. Online hate speech was removed through communication with community standards teams. Responding to raids and evictions, UNHCR, NGOs, and RLIs found emergency housing, negotiated with landlords, and provided financial assistance to cover rent. These short-term fixes were coupled with lobbying and government dialogue, which resulted in a response from the Federal Territories Minister, Tan Sri Anwar Musa, who said that those who are recognized by UNHCR should be allowed to rent and not be evicted. The Deputy Minister agreed to facilitate a meeting with the Residents Association of Seliang on evictions, and also stated a commitment to work with civil society and UNHCR to accelerate work rights in 5 sectors for refugees.
Hi, Brian, we've run out of time.
Okay, I'll just
Wrap up.
Finish up. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what underlies all of these examples is a whole of society approach. In the process of developing local protection capacity, we're building the infrastructure for operationalizing protection through governmental and non-governmental service providers in a well-coordinated network, well-resourced, well-supported by a diversity of local, national, regional, and international actors. This is a long-term sustainable approach that will result in improved responsibility sharing among states and meaningful participation for a greater number of refugees in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have the chat function open if anyone would like to add questions or comments. Some questions have already started coming in, so thank you very much for that. So we will move swiftly along to our next speaker, and that is Dr. Christos Tevas from Democritus University in Greece. And he will be speaking about the Council of Europe as a change factor for the global refugee regime, from human rights theory to refugee protection. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to participate in this year's annual conference of the RLI and to be among distinguished colleagues of this panel with very interesting presentations and with Ms. Kanza as moderator. Many thanks for the organization. Without losing time, I would like to link my subject with the overall topic of the conference and to show how the Council of Europe perspective and role relates and fits to the questions of this year's conference. The main questions of the conference are the following. Just for reminding, does the regime need to change? What needs to be changed? Where does the change need to happen? In which regions or institutions? Who should be responsible for change? How do we get from here to there? Let's make a short introduction by trying to answer the first 3 questions and then focus more on the last 2. First, does the regime need to change? I think we all agree that the global refugee regime needs change. Without change, there is no evolution. It has been said that adapting is a type of intelligence, and it is obvious that refugee challenges arise within all asylum and regional human rights systems. Thus, the refugee law needs adapting, which means changing, which means evolving. Think of 2015 humanitarian crisis, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Global Compact on Refugees, the new pact, the EU new pact on migration and asylum, with any adjustments they need. They are all examples of adapting. What needs to be changed? I would say issues that challenge the actual system, the asylum system, a refugee protection system, and even a migration management or border management system are or need to be human rights systems, first of all. There are standards to be followed and no one can escape them. So to my view, the Council of Europe has this power to change the way those standards are implemented or to spot the gaps and shortcomings and support the change. Where does the change need to happen? In the European region, the regional system of the Council of Europe, which contains more countries than the EU countries and asylum systems. And it is the perspective of the European human rights law. Who should be responsible for change, taking into account the role of international organizations or agencies responsible for asylum and migration law, such as UNHCR, IOM, UNICEF, or the EU Agency for Asylum. I shall focus on the role of the Council of Europe on refugee rights and protection. And let's see how this can be done. And by commenting on actors, their actions and responsibilities, the purpose is inevitably to comment on human rights and refugee protection standards. First, the Special Representative on Migration and Refugees. The mandate of the Special Representative was established in 2016 in response to the humanitarian crisis. That was an adjustment of the system as well. Gathering information on the rights of refugees and migrants in Europe can have positive impact. So the country reports of fact-finding missions are an essential tool, given also the reality of high numbers of refugees and migrants in specific countries. Take, for instance, the report of the fact-finding mission to Turkey in 2021 as the most recent. The report is structured around aspects such as access to asylum, treatment of vulnerable categories, border issues, reception, detention, etc. And the Akkad versus Turkey judgment of June 2022, very recent, on the forced return of a Syrian national, is an example of shortcomings of the system. Under her mandate, the Special Representative provides advice and input to the Secretary General and to member states on human rights standards in the field of migration stemming from the European Convention on Human Rights and other relevant Council of Europe instruments. Part of the thematic work is the protection of refugee and migrant children. And the office is currently coordinating the effective implementation of the action plan on protecting vulnerable persons in the context of migration and asylum in Europe. As a first conclusion, we could say that if we look closely at the issues that arise before the representative, there are issues that are traditionally refugee protection issues, issues of international refugee law, and it seems that part of the duties on refugee protection and refugee and migrant rights is being channeled inevitably to the regional level, to the Council of Europe. Now going to the Parliamentary Assembly, which contains also the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons. The Assembly can put political pressure on member states. We can consider the debate of June 2022 on United Kingdom agreement on asylum seekers and the European Court decision. Through its resolutions, the Assembly affirms the principle of human rights standards. The resolution on the protection and alternative care for unaccompanied separated migrant and refugee children is very important. The resolution on humanitarian consequences and internal and external displacement in connection with the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The committee's report on safe third countries for asylum seekers, where the committee calls for greater coherence in assessing which third countries are safe for asylum seekers, and development of new and up-to-date criteria at the Council of Europe level for states to assess the safety of third countries. The report of 2022 on pushbacks on land and sea, illegal measures of migration management, the role of EU institutions on human rights protection, the role of Frontex, the resolution of 2022 again on EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, human rights perspective. The Assembly notes that the proposals included in the Pact are very complex and there are concerns for the proposed accelerated asylum procedures. And it seems that the Assembly's work breaks down the obligations and solution presents the core of human rights standards by making the appropriate connections with the Refugee Convention, but also relevant EU legislation. Further, the Commissioner for Human Rights, with her 2022 recommendation on pushbacks, there are overwhelming evidence of pushbacks across Europe, said the Commissioner. All Council of Europe member states must recognize pushback as a serious pan-European problem, requiring all of them to act. Finally, the action plan on protecting vulnerable persons in the context of migration and asylum in Europe, a plan of 2021 till 2025. The Committee of Ministers have adopted this plan, which aims at addressing main challenges and opportunities on protecting those individuals, vulnerable persons in the context of migration and asylum. What is interesting from this plan, and I would like to highlight for the sake of this paper, is the key factors that provide a rationale for this action plan, which are the unique role of the Council of Europe as a standard-setting organization, its key values and main interventions, its unique geographic scope encompassing the dynamics of migration across countries of origin, transit, and destination, its cooperation with external partners, the EU, UN, its work with national parliaments through its parliamentary assembly, and its capacity to address emerging trends and challenges. Now, passing to the conclusions, I would say that the Council of Europe can be the institution to bring change in Europe, introduce well-established notions, human rights concepts, and protection standards, fill any gaps of responsibility. On the one hand, the change and improvement of the global refugee regime pass through specific human rights standards. On the other hand, the Council of Europe, a legal system, has an obligation to respond to challenges of refugee and migrant protection. And this can be done also through the European Court's case law. And from the analysis, we made a great challenge of the Council of Europe seems to be the European standards on legal remedies, complaints mechanism, and effective investigations at borders, the human rights challenges because of pushbacks. So someone might think finally that there is a duplication of duties with other organizations, but to my view, there is no duplication of duties. All these aim at the enforcement of human rights in the global refugee regime. And finally, I would say that a change is needed in the global refugee regime, and the regional human rights systems can be part of this change of perspective, as the refugee law practitioners and academics and the national level need to turn their focus at the regional level as well at the Council of Europe as an agent of change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Christos. So we're going to go to our last panelist, which is Dr. Magdalena Schmezek, independent researcher from Canada. And she will be speaking about citizens' assemblies and the evolving psyche of refugee law in Europe and globally. Over to you, Dr. Magdalena.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Greetings from Western Canada, so even earlier in the morning than Sophie over here. And I want to start by saying that we can all be agents of change as global citizens. And as a former refugee myself, I believe that the experience of refugees has a direct impact on creating agents of change. So today I want to suggest first on the theory side that there is a link between refugee law and the social psychology of inclusion and exclusion. And on the practice side, that citizens' assemblies around the world can serve the evolution of law. So the first proposal can be found in the book, The Evolving Psyche of Law in Europe, The Psychology of Human Rights and Asylum Frameworks, that I published last year. And in this research, I used theories of social psychology to analyze the global European refugee regime and how it evolves through three frames: identity formation, cost-benefit calculation, and threat perception. And in more recent publications, I focus on social movements that are changing ideas of identity and human values and how they are expressed in laws. So if you find me on Twitter or other social media, all the links are there and we can connect. So the overall argument is that social psychology, shared emotions, empathy, fear, identity, social categorization, of course, affects laws and values of people. And that a broader human self-identity based on human dignity as a central focal point does drive new legislative shifts and a co-creation that can change both the psychology and the law. And citizens' assemblies are part of this process. So they are a form of participatory and deliberative democracy. And a very large citizens' assembly experiment was the Conference on the Future of Europe that occurred for 1 year, and it just ended in May 9th of this year. And it is intended as a bottom-up approach. We've heard this already, that gives citizens a greater role in say in shaping the future of the EU. It was co-chaired by the European Parliament, the Council of the EU, and the European Commission. It included discussions and debates from citizens across Europe. So there were 800 people altogether, 4 panels of 200 people randomly selected by gender, age, geographic region, socioeconomic background, level of education. There was also matters of, ensuring gender balance and that youth were represented. And there were 9 topics, and one of them was the EU and the world / migration. So they identified the problems and the solutions needed. And they also had national, so it was organized transnationally, but they also had national events. And this panel on the EU in the world and migration had their final meeting in February, just 11 days before the invasion of Ukraine. So it would have had a different outcome, I think. And the proposals that have come out have very progressive tones. So I'll give you an example. Within the panel, the stream 4, they were organized according to streams. There was one entitled Migration from a Human Point of View, which is already interesting in itself. And the first point, the first substream, was on the remedy of causes of migration. So the panel adopted a recommendation that the European Union should participate actively in the involvement, economic development of countries outside of the Union from where there is an influx. And they made a special point about climate migration. They found that the EU has essentially no response strategy, even though Europe is responsible for contributing to the causes of climate migration. So they also, the panel noted that the word crisis is used too lightly, even with the aim of provoking fear. And this is all coming from the report, so I'm quoting a bit here. The final report states that the upcoming refugee crisis that will arise from the climate crisis mandates a separate protocol for action. And as part of this protocol, the EU must expand the definition of refugees and asylum seekers to be comprehensive and include the people affected by climate change. However, the proposal on climate migration was not adopted. So some were adopted, some weren't adopted, but it's in the report, so it's very significant. Under the heading of human consideration, they had a heading called just human consideration. They observed that there's a lack of solidarity in the EU member states, noting that some use migration as a fear-inducing tool, while others are good at integrating migrants and emphasize the positive aspects of migration. So they recommended that there should be a coherent joint action on the issue of refugees based on the principle of solidarity. They also recommend a proactive common EU policy that emphasizes positive aspects of migration, noting that there's prejudices and stereotypes that people hold about migrants that come out of poverty. And they recommend promotion of destigmatization and a more consistent human rights-based approach. It's interesting, one of the proposals that was not adopted focused on human trafficking and smuggling, but the panel suggested that, or proposed, that there should be an immediate enhancement and funding of legal humanitarian roads and means of transport of refugees from crisis in an organized manner. So these are things to take note. On integration, Another interesting quote from the report. They write, refugee camps are a sham, ineffective action in relation to people who have to leave their country due to crisis, and this requires action at the global level. They suggest well-functioning centers with good conditions and concrete help and integration that starts already at the borders. They considered not only socioeconomic integration, but also cultural integration to change the perceptions of refugees by the host countries, by telling migrant stories. I think we heard that already today. And they said, quote, ways of informing people that also touches them emotionally, a prerequisite for change in attitude. They acknowledge there's anti-immigrant perceptions and they want to reach those people. And finally, the panel acknowledges prejudices are based on the miserable living and accommodation conditions. And for that, they recommended a reception conditions directive be replaced by a regulation, compulsory, and a specific monitoring body for this. So what is the effect of all this? There's, of course, much more in the report, and there's many reports. So here it's only a taste that I'm mentioning. Now, the main discussion around citizens' assemblies is how will these recommendations be incorporated into legislation? And the European Commission, for now, sees it as just consultative, but there are calls for a permanent transnational European Citizen Assembly. And the panels call on the EU to enact binding law and regulation so that there's an institutionalization of randomly selected socially representative EU citizens that deliberate on the proposals. And this would include new legislation, treaty change, EU-wide referendums, and binding recommendations from citizens. And some states are taking note of this and already doing it at the national level. So what about refugee participation in citizens' assemblies? Well, advocates also call for radical inclusion and diversity for assemblies that should include third country nationals, non-citizens in the EU, and citizens of EU candidate and neighboring countries. There's a coalition of organizations called Citizens Take Over Europe that strongly advocate that, and this is a quote, marginalized communities, including EU residents without EU passport and undocumented people, should be proportionally represented or even overrepresented among the panel members to ensure adequate inclusion and not just tokenism, so that the experiences of people most affected by the systems of oppression are at the center of concern when problems are analyzed. In the absence of their central involvement, the EU is bound to fail by reproducing the very systems that lies at the root of the societal problems it wants to address. So, I suggest that giving a voice directly to people experiencing crisis would truly be looking at migration from a human point of view, the way that the assembly suggests. So there have been other assemblies around the world. So one was Palermo in October 21 that included a declaration at the end that came up with a provision that everyone should have the right to choose their place of home and climate asylum should be recognized. That's really innovative, that's progressive. There was also a global assembly in November 21 that informed the United Nations COP26 on climate action. And the People's Declaration said that they mentioned specifically climate displacement as the effect of undermining human rights by climate change and ecological crisis. And there's also calls to make the Global Assembly a permanent feature of the UN. So in conclusion, can this change refugee law in Europe and globally? Well, we can take some comfort in the compassionate responses to Ukrainian refugees that magnify, yet again, the social psychological biases about identity, protection, deservingness, who belongs and who does not. But a closer dialogue between citizens, non-citizens, and the legislative bodies with more perspective of a global citizenship can serve a more coherent and just refugee regime. Not just in how it is reflected in our laws that guide our minds and behaviors, but in the minds and behaviors that themselves ultimately guide the laws. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Right on time. So we can turn over to some questions. So the first question we have is for Dr. J. So great to hear that celebrating the transnational identity of refugees, supporting grassroots development. And do you have any links to share? That question is from Gemma Perkins. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Gemma. So in terms of my own publications, no, I don't have anything to share at the moment. I'm really happy to give you my email and discuss anything of relevance. I do have I guess, the information of the participants to my research, which for the moment I'm being a little bit careful about because of the since the military coup, there's been a lot of crackdown on sort of activities, even of refugee participants who are not in Myanmar. So I try not to disclose their identities in public. So I'll be happy to share individually through email if that's okay.
Awesome. Yes, thank you so much for that. I think you can add your details to the chat feature. I know Dr. Magdalena also did mention social media. So if you're comfortable in doing so, please share that in the chat so that we can find you after this session. The next question is for Christos from Dr. Sarah, and that's thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm curious whether the CJEU may be considered a more appropriate regional body of change, as it has a more direct refugee mandate with the right to asylum in EU Charter.
Yes, thank you very much. I think both courts, the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights of Strasbourg, could be characterized as regional courts, as refugee courts, given the case law that they produce. I think the European Court in Strasbourg includes also the case law of Article 3 of Article 2, and in general, the Council of Europe as an organization contains monitoring mechanisms aligned with the court mechanism. So I think the mandate and the outcome could be broader. It's very characteristic, significant. If we see the report that I have referred to of the committee of the Parliamentary Assembly of 2022 on safe third countries for asylum seekers, and allow me to quote part of this report. The committee says that welcoming the work of the European Union Agency for Asylum towards a coordinated approach within the European Union to evaluate the safety of third countries, the Assembly believes that respective coordinated efforts should also be taken on the level of the Council of Europe. So I think first a committee, a political organization, a political committee inside the Council of Europe thinks that the Council of Europe has potential in order to enhance the human rights standards in refugee asylum cases. And I think that, as I said, the Council of Europe, with all the monitoring mechanisms, the committees, etc., aligned with court mechanism, can have a broader, let's say, mandate or outcome for human rights standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christos. The next question is for Dr. Park from Brian Barber. And I understand that South Korea's refugee law was drafted by lawyers and civil society actors and picked up and adopted by the government of South Korea. This is another good example of the ground-up approach. I'm wondering about law and policy development in South Korea and refugee and civil society engagement in that process.
Thank you very much for that question, Brian. And in different parts of my thesis, this is also mentioned. I've been part of, so I was working for the government when the refugee bill was put to the National Assembly, and then eventually it has been passed and enacted in 2013. And you're right, the bill has been drafted by a group of civil society members, and they played a huge role from the beginning. So as I mentioned, that the refugees themselves the Burmese refugees themselves played a role in awareness raising of refugee issues at the time when Korea didn't really understand why refugees would even come to Korea. Back at that time, when I was a member of the civil society, it had to do with a lot of negotiating with the government on access to asylum from the beginning. So they've been heavily involved from the beginning. And because of these experiences, they could put some of the experiences they have into a body of law that has been passed. And it's still an ongoing process. They are active in directly involved in policy consultations to some research that has been commissioned to civil society members. They participate in the running of the reception center and all of that. And it's an ongoing partnership. I also wanted to mention, Sophie, I really liked your comment on the recognition of the transnational identity, and also the fact that political refugees is just another way of making class distinctions between refugees, which we really do not want to promote. However, it was something very strong back when, and even now for my refugee participants. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Yeah, I think it, especially in South Africa where I grew up, my son. Yeah, especially in South Africa where I grew up, it's almost like the only legitimate refugees were political refugees, and everyone else had to either pretend to be one to be recognized, or they weren't validated. So the next question is for Dr. Magdalena. And how representative of the general public are members of the Citizens' Assembly in light of growing racism, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiments in the public, and also in government departments of Europe and other countries?
Yeah, great question. I think is from Jay. Yeah, thank you. So I'll just mention again, because I mentioned in the presentation very quickly, at the European panels from the Conference on the Future of Europe, they were randomly selected for sociological and geographical diversity based on gender, age, geographic region, socioeconomic background. And the gender balance was supposed to be per country, per member state, one woman, one man. So there's also issue of, non-binary persons or so on, but that's the way they have done it, per panel, and also a larger portion of youth. So there was an emphasis on youth. Now, did it adequately represent the diversity to address the issues of anti-immigration and race? And the analysis is no, because I mentioned the coalition Citizens Take Over Europe. They've been following it closely, as have other organizations, and have done an analysis. And they really advocate for more diversity, more inclusion, and as I had mentioned, and even an overrepresentation so that these issues can be addressed. And I think, especially now with so many Ukrainian refugees in Europe or around the world, really, there should be an emphasis also on Ukrainian refugees. But with that, I think if Central Europeans, I'm Central European, are more receptive to Ukrainian refugees, they should be more receptive to all refugees. I mean, it really kind of pushes us to pushes people to rethink their ideas of who is an insider and who is an outsider, and who do we help. I also want to mention very briefly the Global Assembly, because I had noted that it was a global assembly from people from around the world that fed into the UN deliberations on climate change. And the representation was very interesting. And I'm just reading from an article. Again, if you go to my Twitter, the links will be there. It was 100 person core assembly that is intended to represent the current global population. And the participants are evenly split between men and women. 60 from Asia, 17% from Africa, and 70% of members have incomes of less than $10 per day. So yeah, it was really intended to be representative of the diversity, but do they always get it right? No, and I think that's what we can all be advocating for, is that there should be more of an inclusion of greater diversity. I think there's actually a similar question later on, so maybe I just go ahead and answer it, Sophie?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so the question is, participation is often stifled among refugees and asylum seekers, particularly in jurisdictions where their legal status is insecure. Wondering how the constraints, barriers to participation can be addressed. Yeah, exactly, I think about this. So, we kind of have to be realistic about things that, as I'm saying, there's a lot of advocacy to include refugees and asylum seekers in these kind of discussions. Definitely, I think these assemblies, when they're being organized by these major institutions, by the Council of Europe and European Parliament, there's going to be some limitations. But the citizens' assemblies can also be organized at the local level, and they should be organized at the different levels, and they can be more inclusionary, and they can and should be more receptive to that. But the other thing I think about, I work for UNHCR for many years, and you may be familiar that there's something called the AGDM process, the Age, Gender, and Diversity process, where UNHCR and all the NGOs and the program colleagues go and speak with refugees and get their input so that the programs can be better involved. Well, I think that those processes should be merged. That it's not only the programs for the refugees themselves, but the refugees have a say in the political process itself. And so that's what I would like to see. I would like to see, and there was a mention, I think, from Brian, and everybody really, this greater collaboration between the NGOs and the civil society and the UN organizations, and really working as a team. And then taking that next step forward is greater collaboration and empowerment and inclusion of the refugee and asylum seeker voices themselves, regardless of status. And advocates, and I mentioned this in the presentation, advocates emphasize this, regardless of status. Those are the people that we should be hearing more from, that have the most insight really on how the systems need to be improved.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then, so Dr. J has asked, Brian, would you have any examples of political or democratic diffusion among different Asian states on addressing refugee issues? And also before that, Brian answers the question, if anyone has any more questions, please put them into the chat right now. We're going to take about 2 or 3 more questions, and then we are going to wrap up the session.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Dr. Park, as well. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the best examples is Japan and Korea, actually, influencing each other's laws and policies quite a bit. Japan became the first resettlement country, for example, and Korea followed very soon after that. Laws have often mirrored each other. Thailand has an alternatives to detention program for children right now, and I know that Malaysia and other countries are looking at it and will be influenced by each other. Bangladesh and India to a certain extent. And I also think, I mean, the governments aside, the legal communities among all these jurisdictions talk a lot, and they do influence each other. They share arguments. There was a really important judgment in Hong Kong, and there is a case being argued right now in the Supreme Court of India, and the lawyers talked to each other and shared, which arguments were successful. And so there is a lot of influence between governments, between various stakeholders in each of these countries. And but there also I think we can look at the local level, the national level, the sub-regional and regional, like each of these levels, there may be different kinds of influence that exists. And it can be quite strategic, actually, to figure out what works in a particular country, which country is most influential for that country, and then to utilize that when you're developing an advocacy strategy, for example. There is another question in the chat box for me. Maybe I can read that out and respond to it. So I referred to the question is, I referred to your comment about the importance of the implication and complementary aspects of all local stakeholders to develop local protection. How can we overcome the challenges related to CSOs and NGOs funding dependence, which greatly influences their agenda? This is often a challenge affecting the durability of protection efforts and intentions to work on long-term sustainable solutions. Yeah, absolutely. The people with the money have a lot of control over what happens. And those of us without it are trying to do a lot with very little, with a lot of pressure to do things a certain way or to not engage here and to engage there. And you can see the media cycle, political attention moves on very quickly from the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar to Afghanistan to Ukraine, and the other situations are forgotten in that process. How do we get past it? Well, part of it is helped by collaboration. There has in the past been feelings of territoriality and competition, but I think experience shows that when we collaborate with each other, we can raise funds for each other. We can support each other in the work that we need to get done. We can sometimes find pro bono support to fill in gaps. But a lot needs to change with the way that funding is provided internationally. Those who control the purse strings are being unreasonable a lot of the time in the expectations they have and the reporting requirements. These kinds of things create an unnecessary hurdle. And for a refugee-led initiative in a country where they can't register, access to funding seems to be insurmountable. But I don't think it is insurmountable, and I think we can collaborate with each other to try to address some of those gaps. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So I have one last question for everyone else on the panel. And my question is, how are you ensuring that your research and your findings, as well as your recommendations, are digestible, inclusive, and available, especially to grassroots communities and the actual refugees that you are speaking of or for?
I'm happy to go first. Should I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think it's important for us to all reflect on that. I'm a practitioner originally, and I've come to academia later in my career, wanting to go deeper into issues that I saw through practice. But I try to remain very closely connected with practice and with practitioners. And we have some initiatives, for example, through the organization I work with, Act for Peace, to engage refugee researchers. And that includes from the brainstorming and design phase all the way through to completion. They're leading a lot of that research, and it's a really good way to be connected with what's going on. I also try to promote collaboration and networking, whether it's at a local or regional or international level, and try to remain engaged with those networks and listen a lot. because yeah, I don't always need to be the one talking. And I've learned a lot through that process. Thanks.
Who's next? I'll go next. That's a great question. So same as Brian, I was also a practitioner before I went to academia. So that's my insight is working directly with communities, directly with refugees. And you know, I mentioned the AGDM process. One of the things that I really took to heart whenever I was meeting with groups is when the refugees would say, we tell you these things over and over again, you meet with us and then nothing happens, right? And I mean, and it's like this constant, and I feel it, I know it, of course, they're absolutely right. And also we're taking their precious time. I mean, they're, you know, they could be looking for jobs, trying to integrate and so on. So I always felt a bit of frustration in those discussions. They were very useful. They're very useful. Some people are very involved, but there's a sense of frustration. And I think we can change that process. We can make it more empowering, you know, make it, you know, the citizen assemblies, people get paid to do that. There's really no reason why refugee communities shouldn't have good incentives, you know, to travel, to spend their time, to give their input, and not only give their input, be part of ultimately the decision-making process that comes out of it. So how do I do it? You know, it's always a concerted effort. At this moment, I'm very online. So like I said, I put out a lot of things on social media, and even honestly, even among ourselves, even in the academic world, I think we can make things more digestible and available and inclusive, so that we can have these joint conversations that really we feel more, you know, like human beings talking to each other, not just sort of in like these abstract, because that's the problem, right? That's always been the problem, that a lot of these systems that are intended to help people, that are intended to help refugees and asylum seekers, are kind of considered like, you know, out there in the, you know, these elite driven operations, rather than really being integrated and really co-creative. So co-creation, that's, if there's one thing that I'll leave you with, is that the emphasis should always be on co-creation. We all have our roles, they all go together. They're not better or worse. They're very much in need of being integrated. So that's what I encourage, and yeah, hope we improve on that.
I can go next. So thank you for that great question. And I think it's something that I'm constantly thinking about. I think from the beginning of going into academia, like the two speakers before me as well, I do come from a practitioner background. And often I found the discrepancy between what is being said in academia and how that's not really translating into what's happening in practice, or vice versa, or like the reality of policymaking and the suggestions that academics make sometimes don't really match up. So one of the things that I tried to do, which my research was conceived as mostly as a participatory method, it didn't really work out because of the participants' character, and they didn't really engage in this group conversation. But nevertheless, I tried to go back with my findings and say, well, this is what I thought. What do you think about this? And just engaging in a lot of discussions with the participants themselves, saying, well, you know, what do you think about this? Asking their opinion, and then having them also feedback. Well, what you just mentioned reminded me of something else. So this sort of iterative process that we take when we do research is actually quite important. And I'd like to engage more with what with Dr. Magdalena has mentioned about co-creative processes in the future in terms of our research. Also, I think even in the research community, as Dr. Magdalena has also mentioned, I straddle between the migration refugee networks and then also the development networks, who also have their own little silos, and they talk in very different languages. So, you know, straddling between different academic fields is another thing. I do still have connections with UN and the government that I used to work for. So in any occasion I have with my former colleagues, I would try to engage in any policy recommendations that they could actually take to heart. And also, I think, you know, many of us are also engaged in teaching. So I think teaching is a very important way to engage with the multiple ideas and you know, the future of what we can do. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting question. From my side, I would also agree that being a practitioner on mainly on refugee status determination as the caseworker or the reviewer, based on quality assurance of asylum procedures, from also a UNHCR point of view and a more legal, let's say, perspective, I've learned to transform, let's say, these procedures into human rights or refugee rights standards throughout those procedures. So I see gaps, I can see, let's say, good practices gaps and human rights violations throughout those procedures. So my research on the Council of Europe and its role, I think could support the gaps of a national asylum system in any stage we want to talk about of this asylum slash human rights system. So what is missing is the implementation of those standards we talk about in platforms such as or areas such as the Council of Europe. So I think that through by using those standards, through strategic litigation by NGOs, along with a community-based, let's say, approach, or work with refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, that would be a first, let's say, use of such a research and those standards, which are there, but they are not implemented. Second, I would agree that an academic dialogue, an academic diffusion of those standards is very important. Through teaching, I see in master programs, etc., I see, let's say, students on that are practitioners as well. So they want to know about human rights standards, how they are related to refugee law standards, refugee protection. So I can see that the academic part also is a very important part to diffuse those ideas, those standards, those the human rights law. So I see those two aspects.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those elaborate answers. So I'm going to speed through the remainder of the comments. So Gemma works for a UK NGO, which supports settled refugees in developing skills to support their own grassroots community building projects. And they will be hosting an event on the 16th of July, and she has added the link to the event. So please check it out if you can. And then Brian shared a paper that he has co-written on a whole of society approach to the Rohingya refugee crisis. And I was able to find a link online, but there may be a paywall to that one. So if you have trouble accessing the link, please email Brian, and he has shared his email address. And then a message to Dr. Christos. Thank you very much for your presentation. I agree that the implementations of standards is key. And Angela has provided some links to two Council of Europe bodies that were mentioned, PACE, as well as SRSG. So thank you so much for your interaction. And then, yeah, so that will be it for today. Thank you so much for the panel, for sharing your time and your wisdom with all of us.